New York, spring, 1968. A gaggle of children play basketball in the street, unsupervised and uninterrupted. Suddenly, out of nowhere, a car with a driver too preoccupied to pay attention to the road rams into one of the boys, knocking him to the ground, breaking his arm and damaging his internal organs. While in the hospital, the boy's mother decided to add variety to her daily visits and give him a book to read to help pass the time and lift his spirits. The book was Gray's Anatomy, a reference book on the human anatomy, first published in 1858. The boy devoured the book, spending hours staring at the figures and storing them away in his mind for a time not yet known. 1 month later, the child was released from the hospital, arm in a sling and spleen removed. 14 years later, the boy turned man, Jean-Michel, exhibited his work for the first time. The exhibition was successful, and by the end of the night, Jean-Michel Basquiat, who just 1 year prior was homeless, surviving off cheese doodles and cheap Chinese food, had sold each and every painting exhibited and become the hottest artist in the world. Welcome to the Stories We Tell Ourselves podcast, episode 11.
Are you ready for it?
Thank you for joining me for the 11th episode of the Stories We Tell Ourselves podcast. Today, we're going to discuss the subject of curiosity. The good, the bad, and the indifferent. Keeping that in mind, there's really no one I would want to cover in regard to this subject other than Jean-Michel Basquiat. He was an iconoclastic, troubled soul who somehow, through the labyrinth of fame, money, and addiction, managed to produce some of the greatest pieces of modern art while maintaining a childlike curiosity, almost to a fault. To begin, Jean-Michel Basquiat was born on December 22, 1960, to Haitian and Puerto Rican immigrants. As a child, he had a natural aversion to authority, which caused him to be at odds with teachers and students alike. Jean-Michel, unlike most children, had a brilliance to him which to some made him feel as though the rules, whatever they were intended for someone else. Throughout his childhood, he was constantly drawing, and before his mother was admitted to the psych ward of a New York mental institution, they would spend hours at museums and art galleries in order to keep his instinctive mind fed. By the age of 15, due to his recalcitrant nature, Jean-Michel began to run away from home, staying with friends and sleeping on park benches at Washington Square Park and other locales throughout the city. By the age of 17, Jean-Michel ran away for good, living in Lower Manhattan among the other outcasts as a quote-unquote artist. At the time, he and a friend, Al Diaz, began to spray paint sayings and odd quotations on the walls of random buildings in New York under the pseudonym Samo, which stood for Same Old Shit. Over time, a legend began to grow. The art world wanted to know who Samo was and how did he come up with such riveting work. Later, an article in the Soho News mentioned Samo as a new mysterious entry into the art scene. Basquiat announced himself publicly shortly thereafter at a local event. This didn't bring him money, of course, but now there was a face to match the name. Later, after parting ways with his friend and fellow artist Al Diaz, Basquiat was encouraged to paint. A friend even gave him money to purchase materials. Immediately, Jean-Michel began to paint on whatever he could find, whether that's paper or canvas when he could afford it, doors, windows, refrigerators, whatever the moment called for. Postcards became the cheapest and easiest way to make and sell his work in order to make money. Selling for $1, Basquiat would wander the streets selling postcards to whomever would buy them. One day, according to legend and the film, which I found out wasn't exactly accurate, Jean-Michel was hanging out on the street with his friends, and he noticed across the street that Andy Warhol, the most famous artist in New York at the time, had entered the restaurant to eat. Jean-Michel entered the restaurant and presented his postcards to Andy for sale. Impressed, Warhol bought one postcard and sent him on his way. 1 hour later, Basquiat returned with a wet and freshly painted piece entitled Dos Cabezas, or The Two Heads. Not only was Warhol impressed with the quickness of the work he had done, but he could see that the young Basquiat had something that most of the greats had, a strong and sturdy, recognizable hand. Shortly thereafter, his first painting was sold for $200 to a local artist known as Blondie. A big deal at the time, this gave him the encouragement needed to go even harder, but there was a problem. He was still technically poor. At this time, Jean-Michel existed couch to couch. Various friends, various girlfriends. The only thing that didn't vary was his work ethic. And this all culminated at an art show called the Times Square Show, which was an open exhibition that allowed Jean-Michel to stage some of his work. From there, his work was exhibited again at PS1, a contemporary art center in Queens. The year was 1981. The show was a success. Lines down the block, critics and patrons attended with bated breath. One patron in particular, Anina Nosé, was blown away by his work. Jean's star had begun to rise, and Anina was more than eager to benefit from his talent, allowing him to paint in the basement of her gallery for free in the hope that once exhibited, his work would bring him fame and fortune, plus a nice cut for Anina. Upon exhibition, every piece sold that night, netting Basquiat $200,000, over $750,000 in today's money. More importantly, the exhibition proved to his father that the once rebellious child could earn a living without a boss or a cubicle seat. Weeks later, Jean-Michel was able to purchase a large loft on Crosby Street and paint continuously at all hours of the day and night. His method was chaotic, to say the least. Ravel blared from the stereo while piles of books rested on a television which played the evening news. At the same time, conversations about politics and art filled the air from friends and onlookers. It was in this atmosphere that the bulk of his highly regarded paintings came to life. A word, a phrase, a piece of text, all of it became fodder for the canvas, and Basquiat incorporated it all into his work. From there, he began to sell at an astonishing pace. Soon he acquired an art dealer, and at the age of 21, he became the youngest artist to exhibit at Germany's Documenta 7, an exhibition held every 5 years in Kassel, Germany. As a side note, Pablo Picasso exhibited at the first ever Documenta. The only difference was he was 73. By 1983, a single Basquiat painting sold anywhere between $5,000 to $30,000. Basquiat never had a bank account, so most of his money was spent on friends and liquor or hidden between books and underneath couch cushions. He had more money than he knew what to do with, and unfortunately it showed. In the midst of that, a friendship with Andy Warhol came. By 1985, the duo created about 160 works together and even exhibited later that year. Unfortunately, the show was a disaster, panned by almost all critics. Some even accused Andy of usurping Basquiat's hotness in order to revive his failing career. This created a rift between the two of them, causing them to slowly end all communication. Later, Basquiat moved to Los Angeles into a large studio in Venice, where he continued to produce a massive amount of work, even as his slow-rising addiction started to become apparent. The pressure began to mount. His work had become just that, work. Collectors and art dealers demanded commissioned pieces from him under a ridiculous amount of deadlines. And with that, Jean-Michel began to indulge deeper into his heroin usage. At the same time, he wasn't immune to the racist undertones of the art community. His work began to become labeled as primal, an expression of street life. He was even given ridiculous names like the Black Picasso or the voice of the inner city, even though he grew up in a middle-class working family with an accountant for a father. Slowly, distrust started to grow. The hangers-on, the women, and the false security of celebrity all started to push him to a paranoid existence. Jean-Michel was well aware that although he had climbed his way to the heights of stardom, the fall would be swift and lonely. In an effort to get clean, he took his father to Hana, Hawaii for a spur-of-the-moment vacation. Notably, while there, he didn't use heroin once, and his strained relationship with his father had started to strengthen. But there was pain stateside. Sadly, after undergoing a routine gallbladder surgery, Andy Warhol died, leaving Jean-Michel crestfallen over the lost opportunity to mend their broken friendship. His drug habit ballooned to a $1,000 a day habit. In his mind, he started to believe that the drugs were not only the way to keep himself focused, but also the only way he could be able to restore his now fragile career. His final exhibition was in April of 1988 at the Viage Bohemian Gallery in Soho. This was a departure of sorts. The work was dark, reduced, and devoid of vibrant colors and tributes. Even his appearance started to falter. Long gone was the fresh-faced youth eager to delight and surprise. He was now gaunt, and his skin was blotchy and covered with blackheads. From time to time, he would be spotted in various bars in New York or wandering the streets alone. Days later, at the age of 27, he was found dead of a heroin overdose in the same loft rented to him by Andy Warhol. Jean-Michel Basquiat was 27 years old. Now, in his wake, he did leave us with over 1,000 paintings and over 1,000 drawings. Some may say that this was just another tragic end, another tale of art imitating life, the ups and downs of an artist too fragile to weather through the whirlwind of fame and fortune. I believe this was the opposite. A tale of a man who managed to ride his boy-like curiosity as far and as wide as his soul could take him. Today, Basquiat is recognized worldwide as a master of his craft, creating works that will live on for hundreds of years. Recently, in 2018, one of his pieces, Untitled, sold for a staggering $110 million at auction. Now, I'm sure if Basquiat was still alive, he probably would find that amount to be a little bit ridiculous and slightly embarrassing. But at the same time, there's only one Basquiat. We'll be right back.
Are you ready for it?
Thank you for returning. Keeping in alignment with what today's subject is, curiosity, we're going to start the second half with a short story, which I hope aligns with the overall theme. And as always, skipping the preamble, we're going to jump right into it. The name of today's story is called The Groundskeeper. The sun shined above the Westbrook Cemetery in a brilliant assortment of light, heat, and comfort. And as the casket of Harmony Sage lowered into the ground, Henry, her now widowed husband, wept within the arms of loved ones and well-wishers as a hollowness formed within him. Just days before, he sat with Harmony at their kitchen table, planning an extensive and expensive trip abroad. Tickets had been bought, reservations had been made, and fantasies of rekindling their marriage's long extinguished fire had been realized into hope. Their union had a variety of ups and downs in various locales. Memories of laughter in London, tranquility in Paris, and disappointment in Denver fluttered through his mind. He depended on those days, the habitual nature of it. Travel had been their remedy, a cure for boredom, a setting for celebration, a cleansing from arguments and exposed infidelity. Now he stood alone, as the love of his life lowered into the earth, inch by inch, moving further away from any chance of reconciliation. 100 yards away, tending to the upkeep of the man-made lake, Nicholas Owasu, the elderly groundskeeper, watched the weeping Henry with compassion. Nicholas had worked at Westbrook for the last 47 years. From a distance, he had witnessed the burial of politicians and pawns, cops and criminals, and every manner of being in between. Rarely had he witnessed grief of Henry's magnitude. But Nicholas was different. Unlike most people who could only offer condolences and encouragement, Nicholas could do much more. Within moments, Nicholas set down his tools and responsibilities and carefully approached Henry as discreetly as possible. By the time Nicholas reached him, the mourners had entered their vehicles, seated patiently as their engines idled within the procession. Henry, asking to be left alone, stared down at the coffin, rose in hand, trembling underneath the weight of the life to come. As Henry tossed his rose upon Harmony's casket, a dry, lilting voice spoke from behind. "It doesn't need to be this way." Henry turned to find Nicholas, cautious and humble, with his hands clasped at his waist. At first he was taken aback by his looks. Nicholas was small and frail. His dungarees were covered in soot and various stains, and his face was wrinkled so that there wasn't an inch of smoothness. But there was a softness to him, a reprieve beckoning Henry to respond. As their eyes met, Nicholas spoke again. "Your pain," said Nicholas, pointing towards the grave. "It doesn't need to be this way." A rage began to grow within Henry, but before it manifested, Nicholas spoke again. "I mean no harm. I assure you my only aim is to provide a service, free of charge." "What service?" said Henry, while fighting the urge to strike him. "If you are interested," whispered Nicholas, "come back tonight and meet me at the lake. I am always here to serve." Before Henry could respond, Nicholas scuttled off in the same direction he had come, leaving Henry with his thoughts in a clenched fist. That evening, after the last of the attendees in the pretense of strength and difficulty had left, Henry lay in bed sobbing in the dark. In his arms, Harmony's pillow, still permeated with the smell of her perfume, gathered at his chest. Over the last 32 years, their home had welcomed and contained every detail of their life together. The little annoyances, tiffs and apologies, the dinner guests and gatherings, all settled within and along the walls like the many photos hanging throughout. Now, silence echoed and grew louder with each passing second. So much so that as the clock struck midnight, Henry seized whatever clothing he could find, along with his keys, and drove aimlessly through back roads and farmland. It was then that the words of Nicholas Owasu replayed in his mind. What did he mean by, "It doesn't need to be this way"? And how could he ease his pain? That and what seemed like 1,000 more questions fluttered through his mind in an endless onslaught of confusion and regret, until somehow he found himself parked outside Westbrook Cemetery, searching for Nicholas in the dead of night. When he finally found Nicholas, he was exactly where he said he'd be, at the man-made lake, seated in a dilapidated lawn chair, fishing rod in hand, with Chopin's Nocturne Opus 9 No. 2 playing from a small mangled speaker. "Do you believe in the impossible?" said Nicholas with his back to Henry. I don't know. Do you?" asked Henry as he approached. "No. I believe in the possibility of all things," said Nicholas, standing to his feet. "I also believe that if you love someone, not even death can keep them from you. Do you believe in that?" Henry wasn't accustomed to humoring ridiculous notions, therefore he let his silence speak as Nicholas dug into his dirty dungarees and emerged with 2 wooden bracelets. Nicholas went on to explain that hundreds of years ago, as the first slaves made the treacherous voyage across the Atlantic, a king named Ophi was gifted the bracelets by a local soothsayer on the night of his wedding to Albina, daughter of a rival ruler, as a sign of unity between the clans. The soothsayer promised Ophi that as long as the bracelets remained on their wrists, they would be connected eternally, invisibly tethered, and not even death could separate them. Days later, the village was raided by an opposing tribe. Ophi, along with dozens of male members of his clan, were kidnapped and sold to Portuguese merchants. After departing by way of the Cape Coast, Ophi and his fellow captives devised a plan to overtake their captors and return home. The mutiny proved to be unsuccessful. Many of his men were either subdued or killed by the Portuguese, and due to his recognition as the instigator of the insurrection, Ophi was bound and brought to the stern of the ship and unceremoniously tossed into the sea. Underwater, Ophi descended into a watery grave. As the last bubble of air left his lips, he managed to free himself, but by using all of his strength to break loose, he found himself too weak to swim to the surface and drowned in the depths of the Atlantic Ocean. In the afterlife, Ophi began the journey to his ancestors, surrounded by light, following the sound of a beating drum, but his love for Albina wouldn't let him forget her. To his surprise, the bracelet given to him on his wedding day was still on his wrist. In an instant, Ophi began to yank and pull his arm as hard and as frequently as he could. On Earth, Albina, still overcome with grief, awakened to her arm moving about uncontrollably. She screamed and wailed in confusion, running through the village like a madwoman until the soothsayer stopped her and told her to consider the bracelet on her wrist. In fear, she began to remove it, but was told that it was Ophi calling to her from the underworld, and she must focus and pull him to her. After a moment of doubt, Albina tightened her hand into a mighty fist and yanked it upward with all of her might. Suddenly, the sun began to pulsate and brighten to the point that all the villagers shielded their eyes, and when the sunburst finally subsided, Ophi appeared before them. The villagers erupted in celebration and ululations as Albina and Ophi embraced. And for the remainder of their lives, they lived happily ever after, having 7 children and several heads of cattle. After their death, the bracelets were passed down from generation to generation until finally given to Nicholas by his grandmother, a Ghanaian immigrant, on her deathbed. Henry couldn't hide his skepticism. A small chuckle escaped his lips. "What does this fairy tale have to do with me?" asked Henry with a smirk. "Do you not understand?" replied Nicholas. "You too can retrieve your wife. Place this bracelet on your wrist, and I will show you how." Nicholas presented one of the bracelets to Henry, waiting for him to accept it. Henry paused. searching the face of Nicholas for any sign of deception, but there was none. His arm stayed before him, outstretched, with the wooden bracelets mere inches away from his face. Henry relented and placed the bracelet on his wrist. "Now what?" scoffed Henry, barely hiding his contempt. "Follow me," replied Nicholas, stepping into the waters of the man-made lake. Again, Henry paused, but as Nicholas entered further into the lake, stopping at waist length, Henry's reservations faded. Seconds later, after removing his shoes and socks, Henry joined Nicholas in the ice-cold water. "I could explain this to you," said Nicholas, "but you should experience it first. A test, if you will." "Experience what?" asked Henry. "When you are ready, tug 3 times with the bracelet worn on. I will feel it here and pull you back to this ram. Understood?" Before Henry could complete his thoughts, Nicholas grabbed him by the shoulders and with a strength that betrayed his age, submersed and restrained Henry underneath the water. Flailing and kicking, Henry fought to release himself from Nicholas's grip, but it was too strong, too immovable for him to prevail. His chest burned and tore as water seeped into his airway, culminating with his lungs and brain seizing in shock. Henry was now dead. As Henry's limp body floated to the surface, Nicholas calmly returned to his lawn chair, retrieved his fishing pole from his side, and cast the line into the water, Chopin playing in the background. The sound of a beating drum welcomed Henry to the underworld. As he opened his eyes, a stream of pulsating light burrowed into his body, pulling him forward involuntarily. Henry panicked, screamed into the void, but there was no one to help him. Nothing to guide him but the sound of the beating drum growing louder with each lurch forward. After the terror subsided, he looked at his wrist and the wooden bracelet adorning it. Within an instant, Nicholas's instructions replayed in his mind. Henry lifted his arms and tugged 3 times as hard as he could. Suddenly, an invisible force jerked him up and out of the void. Gasping and wheezing, Henry awakened in the waters of Westbrook Cemetery. Nicholas at the ready, pulling him ashore. Collecting his breath, Henry stared at Nicholas in awe. What was that?" asked Henry, trying to wrap his brain around the moment. "The underworld. The pathway to your love," replied Nicholas. I thought you murdered me. I thought I was dead," snapped Henry, still pondering his reality. "You were dead, and I did kill you," chuckled Nicholas. "But it was hardly a murder. I needed to show you that I am not a liar. Now you have a decision to make. Will you return to the void and pursue your love, or will you remain here wallowing in grief?" "Send me back," answered Henry without a moment's hesitation. Before Nicholas could respond, Henry charged back into the water, motioning Nicholas to join him. As Nicholas approached, he warned Henry that time was not his friend. He explained that due to the absence of time, eternity held no measure of it. A day in eternity could equal weeks on earth, and if he wanted to find harmony, he would need to be swift, succinct, and focused on the task at hand. Henry agreed, and within seconds, he was back underwater, fighting with the pain and discomfort of drowning, while Nicholas held him in place as his body throttled until limp. Until the day of his death, Nicholas meandered about the cemetery, anxiously rubbing his wooden bracelet while tending to the grounds. At his funeral, those who knew him and were fond of the old groundskeeper were keen to make sure that he was buried respectfully with his two favorite items, his mangled fishing pole and his treasured bracelet fastened tightly to his wrist. Thank you for joining us for the 11th episode of the Stories We Tell Ourselves podcast. Again, this episode was about curiosity or the pursuit of it. I'd like to thank all of you for joining me again on another episode. As always, in the next 2 weeks, we will be back at it again. Keep in mind, you can always email me at swtomail@gmail.com. That is swtomail@gmail.com. Also, feel free, as always, to leave a review. Email me ideas, thoughts, things you like, things you don't like. I'll always try to adjust it as time marches on. So, signing out. And as always, be safe, be cool, and always, always be mindful of the stories you tell yourself.